This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm Bob, and I go everywhere in Maine in search of fun and adventure. I travel roads from Kakajo to Quagijo, from Karatunk to Sajunkadunk, from Mattawamkeg to Pastadumkeg, from Saboomic to Chesuncook, from Tomhegan to Bascahegan, and everywhere I go I wonder, what on earth do these names mean? Today we find out. The goal of today's show is to make me slightly less stupid about the place I live in. So many places in Maine have been borrowed from the folks who were here first. The Penobscots, the Passamaquoddies, the Micmacs, the Maliseets. The map is riddled with Indian names that meant something to somebody, and often still do. But I don't know what. My guest today is James Francis, Penobscot tribal historian. He's about to explain it all to me and to you. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Van Raymond Outfitters, Hammond Lumber, O'Neill's Power Equipment, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. As today's show begins, I'm on Indian Island in the conference room of the community center. We've got a big map of Maine in front of us that explains many of the Indian place names, and I'm pleased to welcome James Francis to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Thank you, Bob.
It's great to be back on the island. I had Chief Francis on last year as we were taking out the VZ Dam, and it's just a privilege and a pleasure to be back with you again.
Well, you got an upgrade this time.
All right, you are a Penobscot tribal historian, which is about half your title, or maybe just a third. What do you do?
Well, I am also the Director of Cultural and Historic Preservation. For many years, I've been the tribe's historian, studying our history, collecting stories from tribal citizens, but also working on educational outreach to help satisfy the mandates of, I think it's Maine State Law 2001, Chapter 403, which says that all schools in the state have to teach about Maine Indian history and culture.
Well, good, because as I've explained before, I think I drive all over the Maine roads, especially up in the North Woods. I come across all these place names that are exotic to me. I have no idea what they mean, but I know they convey a sense of place and history, and I am absolutely clueless about all that. And so your job today is to make me just that much less clueless.
Well, I hope I can help in that regard.
It's a tough task.
Well, I think an important place to start is kind of where I started. I grew up here on the reservation, went to Old Town High School, was an accomplished runner, and after high school, instead of going to college, I decided to join the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And I found myself living for 4 years in a very alien landscape. Some people call it Cheyenne, Wyoming. And
there's nothing there.
Once you leave town, there's no trees, just these kind of tan rolling hills. But certainly a very alien landscape from what I had left here in Maine. Mm-hmm. And growing up on the island, we spent a lot of time on the river. And I felt very homesick, not for my parents or for my people, but just for the landscape.
Yep.
And about the same time that I was deciding to re-enlist or not, my grandmother had died. And she had said I was given a gift and I had to find a way to give that back. I was a very curious kid and was told a lot of stories growing up. So I decided to enroll at the University of Maine in the history program, and we were studying about the Trail of Tears. Mm-hmm. I was taking a Native American Studies class, and we were learning about the forcible removal of the Cherokee Nation from their homeland to another place. And I was really amazed how they survived in that new place.
Yeah, because they had nothing in common with that land.
They had no connection whatsoever, where in their homeland they had generations upon generations of knowledge of that place. And it really elevated, in my mind, the strength of that people. Mm-hmm. And as I was walking across the campus of the University of Maine that afternoon, I don't know why, but I looked at a pine tree up on Hilltop. I was going back to my dorm, And it struck me that my people, the Penobscots, have never been removed from their ancestral homeland. That same pine tree that I was looking at is a descendant of the pine trees that my ancestors dealt with. And in that instance, at that very young age of 22 or 23, it changed the way I saw the world. It changed what I read, what I studied, classes I took.
Wow. A lot of the place names are obviously of Indian origin. Is it a root Indian language, or are there dialect differences between some of these place names? I'm referencing Passamaquoddy versus Penobscot, or is it all of an Abenaki-type root, or what do these names mean? I mean, Androscoggin doesn't look anything like Penobscot.
No. I mean, a lot of what you find on the map today have been anglicized so much that they tend to not resemble much of what they used to be, and which causes some problems sometimes when we're trying to kind of decode what that means. But the language itself, thinking about native language here in Maine, is we all speak what's called an Abenaki language. So this kind of little umbrella, which includes the languages of Micmac, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet. They share a language. It's hyphenated.
Oh, okay.
And then Penobscot, and they all fall under this little umbrella Abenaki, which falls under a larger umbrella of Algonquian based languages. And this is a very large language group. It includes tribes to the south as far as the Delaware, and as far west into the Great Lakes region with the like Potawatomi and Menominee and Ojibwa, and even further west to the Canadian Rockies. So it's a very large language group. Further you get away from two disparate tribes, the less they sound alike, but they still have those common roots. Like the word for the sun is still either, we call it Gizus, but say Ojibwa may just call it Gi. And, but they are under that common, sometimes called Algic, but Algonquian language base.
Really not all that different than the way languages in Europe developed, because you have the whole suite of Romance languages, and then you have the Germanic languages, a whole different group. But you can see some of the same common roots in words in Europe that you would have seen here.
The problem that we find on the landscape with the place names in reference to the kind of dialect problem is understanding places in areas where there's no clear tribal ownership. And one of the hardest things anybody's ever asked me to do is say, take the 4 tribes in Maine and draw me a boundary between them historically, because there was so much overlap. And also, when you start talking about tribal names, you go back far enough in history, and we're all the same people. So one in particular that has caused a bit of a headache is Kenduskeag. Here for years, people have been calling Kenduskeag Eelweir Place, which makes sense. I mean, the Kenduskeag stream is just full of eels. But if you looked at that through the lens of a Maliseet Passamaquoddy word, that makes a lot of sense. But if you look at it through the lens of a Penobscot word, Frank Siebert said that it meant place of water parsnips. So this kind of this kind of blanched, kind of carrot looking thing.
Can you say though that the keg it means place of?
Yeah, it's a locative. So when you see that keg at the end, it means at the place of.
Good.
So it puts you on the map.
Well, I looked at the map and said, okay, I got Kenduskeag, Passadumkeag, Mattawamkeag, Passagassawamkeag, Wasukeag. The keg has to mean something, and I don't know what it means.
Yeah, it's a locative. That's what they call it in linguistic terms. It's the locative. So in the in the sense of Penobscot Stream, you got to ask yourself, does it make sense? So the eels certainly make sense, and so does the water parsnip.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if it came out in Frank Siebert, the former linguist who worked here for the tribe, said that it meant, cactus place. We could easily discount that name, but in this case, it's as from a tribal sense, we tend to go with the water parsnip species.
Yeah. Is there any place that has fiddleheads in its name?
No.
No,
actually.
there ought to be, probably. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Penobscot tribal historian James Francis is my guest, and we're discussing all those Indian place names in the Maine map and what they mean. For instance, a lot of place names end in unk, or cook, or Scott. Why? The answers are coming up on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today's show is coming to you from Indian Island. I'm with James Francis, who is Penobscot tribal historian. We're looking at all these places in the Maine map that were named long before Europeans got here. You can recognize some common roots. Unk shows up a lot. Nesauudahunk, Sajunkadunk, Kennebunk, Karatunk.
Yeah, the unk and the conversely cook. So hunk and cook kind of go together. Well, they're kind of endings that the unk, like Nesauudahunk. Nesauudahunk means the river that flows between the mountains, and it flows between Katahdin and Double Top. And it's a very rocky granite slide type of a lot of granite slides on the stream, water flowing over granite and carving it and making it smooth, but certainly not a place you'd want to canoe.
Right.
And so David Cook, who wrote a book called Above the Gravel Bar, has asserted that this unk or hunk at the end is denoting non-canoeability. And conversely, you see the cooks, the Sauadaps cook, at the sloping ledge, and Sebasta cook. So Sauadaps cook, which is a stream in near Hamden, it empties into the Penobscot in Hamden. This cook stream, if you will, you can paddle to the headwaters and take a small portage into a pond in the headwaters of the Sebasticook. And so if you follow the Sebasticook down, you'll end up in the Kennebec at a place called Fort Halifax. And that saved a days and days journey of dangerous ocean canoeing to take that journey. So that we often see that Sauadaps Cook, Sebasticook link as the highway west for travel.
How about Scott or Cot or as a place name, a route name? Because you got Penobscot, Sheepscot, Presumpscot. It's something that comes up pretty routinely.
I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where the Scot comes from. When we look at the word Penobscot, it actually, it's got the skek at the end of it, the skeg, the keg. So again, it's an anglicized version. That keg went to something else for some other reason. When we start to collectively look at place names and when we start to decode them, what we find is that we have essentially a roadmap, physical descriptions of places. Sauadaps Cook, sloping ledge, the island just above the one we're on now, Indian Island. Today is called Orson Island, but the ancient name meant it was Kuchi Mugawug Menahan, which meant Big Bog Island. And so it is a big island, and it's about 80% bog. And so that physical description we find throughout the watershed. And Fanny Hardy Exstorm, who wrote a book on place names, always said that 90% of the time when looking at a physical feature that comes from, it's from an upriver perspective. So you have things like Penobscot, which means above the gravel bar. So that's an upriver perspective.
Yeah.
That you have to go through the gravel bar to get to the place, which is the stream they're talking about. And it's a very important place for us because that gravel bar not only was this very identifiable place, but it was an important place for fishing. Because we would set up fish weirs in the gravel bar, and so place names also act as kind of a resource or land use marker.
Well, certainly a gravel bar would have been a place to set up encampments and even homes.
Oh, absolutely, especially where at the confluence of a stream. You know, we have these glacial features to the east of the river, the Horseback and the Whaleback, and historically, geologically, they were all the same piece. It's just been eroded through time through the Penobscot watershed, and that's what we find sitting at the bottom of the Penobscot in the form of a gravel bar. So place names act as those kind of travel markers, or there's a physical, geologic, or geographic description, but also we find land use and resources. The old name for what we call French Island today, or Treat and Webster Island in Old Town, is it was the place where we would tan hides. So it had a very specific use there. That western side of that island where all the ledges are, where the train bridges go across, were a perfect place to tan your hides. So that place kind of gets that name. We have other places like Penobscot. We see that on the map today. Plenty of alewives stream. So we have what remains on the map today as Penobscot up north, which empties into the Penobscot in South Lincoln. But we also have other Penobscotuses, like historically. Blackman Stream, which flows up into where Leonard Mills is, that was also called Penobscotus.
Wouldn't that get confusing?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think it was more about the resource that was there. You know, that there wasn't this exclusivity that you know, when they look at a map. And
it would all be probably in context anyway, because how many mud ponds do we have in Maine?
Right.
You usually know which mud pond you're talking about because of the context of your conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So how
about Hegan? Skowhegan, Tom Hegan, Monhegan.
Yeah. Those Hegans, so Skowhegan is we're talking about like a place where you'd sit and wait. We see that occasionally, the Hegan.
Bascahegan's another one.
Yeah, right. I'm not entirely sure how that translates into what exactly those places mean. Yeah, we do see those quite a bit.
How about Asset, like Carabasset or Abigatasset? Or does that ring any bells at all? That one would be a hard one.
Yeah.
There aren't that many of those.
Right.
Probably a corruption of something that...
It is. You know, what I really try to do is try to rewind as much of that Anglicization back to sounds that are current with the language itself. And what we find is that there was a piece of river here between the earlier mentioned Orson Island and Marsh Island, just a small piece of river, maybe not even a quarter mile long, and it had a name that written on the paper was longer than the channel they were talking about. And Joseph Treat had documented it in 1820 while being guided by old John Neptune. And it was Qualbuck something or other. It's a very long word. And as we started to look at what that meant, we knew that it was similar to this call to get women to turn and spin while they're dancing. And my Uncle Neil had lived, he still does, lives up on Orson Island. He travels the old railroad grade and crosses that piece of the river on a almost daily basis. And I was working on the map, and I had that note written about women turning and spinning, and he sat down and says, "Oh, that makes sense." And I was like, "How?" You know? He says, "Well," he goes, "in the spring when the freshet's here, when the water's high, it flows in one direction. but normally it flows in another. And so I did some historic research and found that before the dam here in Old Town, the Milford Dam, there was actually a set of falls there, and there were a reversing falls depending on how high the water was.
Huh.
So because of the orientation of where this is at the top of Marsh Island, the water could flow in either direction around the island. And so taking this information back to, our language staff, she was like, oh, yeah, it seems to be the place where the water turns back upon itself, depending on the water level. So when we start to look at a place name and start to understand what that means, we really have to kind of step back and get in the Wayback Machine, like Sherman and Peabody, because what we need to do is go out into the landscape and experience that place. So many times we've done these field trips to come back and say, with certainty, this is what it means. It helped a lot. Sometimes we have problems because the advent of dams.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is a lot of these place names are still on the map, but we basically obliterated the feature they described.
Yeah,
because
absolutely,
of dams,
right. For instance, this we're planning a canoe race for August 3rd. We're going to first annual from Indian Island to Brewer. In the past, this would have been a lot more difficult with a lot more portages because of the dams. And with the removal of two dams, one in VZ and one in Great Works, we're able to have a really exciting canoe race with 4 major drops at those sites. But for instance, where the dam was in VZ, that had a name called Whitewater Cascade. Huh. And to me, which is it's just very descriptive. I can picture it as you come around the corner of Eddington Bend on the river, coming up river. You see this cascades of white as you pass Sobscook, which was a rock which meant the boiling rock, right at the head of tide. That's what they considered head of tide up there at Eddington Bend. What's more interesting is where the dam was taken out at Great Works. It was the bad falls at the site of a bad carry. So it wasn't something that you'd want to come up to.
Yeah.
Marsh Island itself was known as Slippery Ledge Island, and there's a feature in the river at called Marsh Island Rips, where the ledges are really slippery, and it's would have been a difficult part of the river to pole up, or even to get a paddle in the water to try to paddle up. And so when you think about that portion of the river between Orono and Old Town on the main stem of the river, the term Stillwater comes into play. I struggled with the Stillwater for a long time because not only is it the name that we see on the map today, and sometimes we find this, we have names that are there in spirit to today. They're in English, but they're taking that kernel of what that place meant and just turning it into English. My ancestors called Stillwater River Stillwater forever because it wasn't so much. The reason why it was confusing to me is when you're at the mouth of where the Stillwater meets back to the main branch, there was a massive set of falls there. Not only there, but also on the main stem. We call that Basin Mills today. So the old name for Basin Mills was falls where the river forms a channel. So description. But what confused me about that, you get this great set of falls at the mouth of Stillwater, but yet we called it Stillwater. Well, why? Much like the Hunk and the Cook, it was conveying something about the canoeability, that this is the way you want it to go. And traveling north on the river, upriver, taking the Stillwater around was the easier way rather than going over Slippery Ledge or trying to go up Slippery Ledge and also getting to, the bad falls at the site of a bad carry.
You're listening to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Penobscot tribal historian James Francis is my guest. We're talking about all the Indian place names in the Maine map and what they actually mean. Obviously, rivers were clearly the highways of the local tribes over the last 10,000 years, and most place names are about these waterways. But are there any place names that aren't about rivers? That's next. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Penobscot tribal historian James Francis is my guest. So many place names in Maine were given to us by the native tribes when Europeans first got here. We're trying to figure out what they all mean. Since rivers were so important to the tribes, most place names have to do with rivers. So are there place names that aren't about rivers?
Katahdin. Yeah. Blue Hill, that's a name in spirit still today. Mm-hmm. We always called it Blue Hill.
Really?
Yeah. No, but it all harkens back to travelability. Mm-hmm. We used to spend the summers on the coast because of the food source and to get away from the bugs. But that coastal travel in Penobscot Bay, you always had that blue marker on the horizon to orient yourself to, and that was Blue Hill. Katahdin's pretty interesting. It means greatest mountain, and so often I find myself correcting people who say Mount Katahdin because they're saying Mount Greatest Mountain, and so it deserves the respect just to be called Katahdin. And but what's interesting about that term Greatest Mountain is people will often say, oh well, yeah, that's the tallest mountain in Maine. That makes sense. That's a great place name. But
it goes a little beyond that, doesn't it?
Well, it does, because first of all, it was named Greatest Mountain before we knew what Maine was, and and then you have like Mount Washington just across the border of Maine, which is bigger. Yeah. And plus, we didn't really know how high it was until either Turner or Jackson does their geological survey in the 18 teens or so, 1820s. So it's not about its size. The greatness is comes from something else, and something a little less tangible, I think. And we all feel it when we're there. We go there, and there's something about that mountain that we get from no other mountain. Yeah. So we have stories of Gluskop, and it is said that he went north, and that is his lodge. So I mean that from a cultural standpoint, that piece is there also. But I think that on a personal level, there are so many stories of its greatness, and from a not geography standpoint, where it lies within the watershed. It's all the water that runs off that mountain flows past us here on Indian Island. It surrounds the community, and so there's a connection there also. Yeah. So it's interesting to kind of really look at the landscape today. There was a cultural geographer named Ifu Tuan, and he came up with this very simple formula. He said that space, an area, plus culture equals place. So that culture piece is very important for the understanding of place, just beyond like an area. Yeah. And what I have been doing for the last 20 years is to really try to look at an ancient place, a place that my ancestors, that the Penobscot culture named, an older place, and we can look at place names, and they kind of act as windows into the past of how my ancestors saw the landscape. Yeah. But as we've been discussing, there's a few hurdles in the way, and it's allowed me to explore, the outdoors and with a certain lens.
That's exactly why I wanted to do this show today, because I have the same sense of place, and I have no understanding of what that sense is. I feel it, I just don't understand it because I don't have the references. And I'm Duchesne on one side of my family. My mother's maiden name was LaPlante. So, my generations go back in this landscape only a few hundred years to come catch some beavers, I suspect.
Yeah.
Because my ancestors weren't fishing people, so I can pretty much, point to somewhere in Montreal where they settled down and then migrated here. But my history goes back only a couple hundred years. But the Penobscots go back 10,000 years to the melting of glaciers.
Yeah.
So I'm missing like 9 to 10,000 years of a sense of place here just because I don't understand it.
Yeah, and the thing is, today we talk about a sense of place. I grew up in Old Town here on Indian Island, but the vastness of place. When we talk about an ancestral territory of the Penobscot Nation, you can't stop at this island or the reservation, which is all the islands in the river, or even the watershed, because the connections to the adjacent watersheds and how far does that stretch? And you think about the colonization of New England, and Indian people just don't disappear. They were pushed out and they were moved to other places, and certainly our community becomes one of those places that were accepting of people moving into the area. But when you really start to kind of look at that sense of place, you really start to get an appreciation of Maine, the outdoors, and conservation and preservation, and so it's been a fun journey.
Yeah. The guy in the journey is James Francis, Penobscot tribal historian. I'm Bob Duchesne. We're figuring out what all those Indian place names in Maine mean. Up next, are there Indian place names named after people? On Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Penobscot tribal historian James Francis is my guest as we learn about all those Indian place names in the Maine map. One thing I find curious, it's been a European tradition to name places after people. It doesn't seem to be a lot of places in the state that are named after people. Addian Lake comes to mind, but I can't think of many others.
Yeah, Orono.
Yeah, well... yeah, duh.
Chief Joseph Orono was one of our chiefs.
Yeah, I forgot about that one. Phillips Lake, would that have been?
Oh, probably not.
Probably, yeah.
No, the name Phillips is in our community today.
Yeah.
In fact, that's my mother's maiden name.
Oh, okay.
But that came from a Mohawk community, Akwesasne. My great-grandfather met my great-grandmother's sister at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and then he came home with her and ended up marrying her sister. So,
any other places you can think of right off the top of your head that are actually named after people instead of places?
There
just don't seem to be many.
Well, Castine kind of, but that's the Baron of Saint-Castin. He had a different name. But that's Saint-Castin is a small town in southern France where Jean-Vincent Abadet, who was the Baron, came, and he ended up marrying a chief's daughter, Molly Mathilde. And so very early on, our chief bloodline gets mixed with French nobility. That Castine... there aren't many. I mean, here in Maine, we name places. I kind of categorize them in three different ways. We have the naming after people like the Lincolns and the Waldos and the Washingtons, Phippsburg, et cetera, et cetera. But we also have, and I'm sure you've seen the famous signs, we name place after other places, the Swedens, the Norways, the Chinas, Denmark, all these places in Maine with in the postcard sign. There's two of them, one near China and one out, I think they're Paris or somewhere.
Towards, Paris, Bethel, in that direction.
Yeah,
anyway.
Right. But here in Maine, we also name place what I like to call the way life should be places. And they seem to be in the central coastal region, places like freedom and harmony, hope, unity, union, those type of names. So Penobscot Place is really based on this whole idea of a description of the place, and then also land use or kind of resource based, your birch streams, your hemlock islands. And we have even have some legends that kind of reinforce a sense of place or embed story into the landscape.
I wrote down a bunch of famous names in Maine that are clearly of Indian origin. And let's see how many you can think of off the top of your head where you might know what they mean, like Allagash.
Allagash has something to do with birch.
Okay.
Birch houses, I believe.
How about Eggamogan?
Eggamogan is the great fishware place.
Norwich Walk?
Knowledge Walk. I don't know that one off the top of my head.
You go up into New Brunswick and you see the same corruption of the name. There's like a Norwich Walk up there. And I've seen the corruption somewhere else, too. So clearly that one's a significant one that means something, and I don't know what it means. Messalonsky, how about that one?
No idea.
Yeah. Narraguagus? Madawaska.
Madawaska.
I wasn't even sure that was Indian derivation. It's just so...
It is. Yeah. It is. I've looked at that one before, Madawaska, and it's if you go on the website, they talk about a couple of different ideas about it, but I don't know for sure.
How about Pushaw?
Pushaw, yes, that's definitely a name. It has an older name. It sounds nothing like Pushaw. But it's the lake of submerged shoals. So,
and it still is today.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's the shallowness.
I watch the jet skis go by there saying, I hope you know where the rocks are.
What's real interesting about Pushaw is that in the spring, when the river was very high, it was easier to pole up the Kenduskeag and go into a small stream and then do a small portage in the Pushaw and then paddle the length of the lake and come out Pushaw Stream, and you're above Old Town. So the whole key was to get above the falls in Old Town. That the river drops about 100 feet and 12 miles from Old Town to Bangor, and that's considerable uphill battle. And so any way we could find to not have to do that, whether it's to go up the Stillwater part of the way or to go up the Kenduskeag and portage into Pushaw, that was also an option.
How about
Cocaggio, yeah. So we have a word for the kettle, and that's very close to Cocaggio. Little Spencer Mountain historically was known as Kettle Mountain, and it's tied to a story of Glooskap, and Glooskap was hunting moose, or teaching people how to hunt moose, and a cow moose and a calf moose came out of the forest. And he picked up a stone off the ground and he affixed it to a stick, notched it in a bow, and he shot the cow moose dead. Now, when Henry David Thoreau was paddling the length of Moosehead Lake with his guide Joe Polis, he wrote that my guide tells me this mountain that rises dark before us was anciently a cow moose. So that cow moose he shot turned to stone and became what we know today as Mount Kineo. Now, she didn't turn it to just any stone. She turned it to that stone that Glooskap had picked up off the ground and affixed to a stick. You know, the story's telling us that Kineo is a repository for stone, perfect for making arrowheads.
Right.
And the calf moose gets all excited and knocks over a kettle that Glooskap had ready to cook the moose in, and that becomes Kettle Mountain. And Cocaggio is related to that because it's proximity.
Yeah. How about Suncays?
Suncays, the stream that comes into view from concealment.
That would fit.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. There's an account in the Maine woods where either that or in Treat where they're talking about they see somebody moving strangely across the land. You know, probably across Mikowski's field, and they seem to be floating. And what they are, they're on that back channel, floating in a canoe, standing up. and they didn't realize there was a stream there until you get right on top of it.
Yeah.
It comes into view from concealment.
It must be a place name like River Always Blocked by Beavers.
Yeah, right.
If not, there should be. How about Millinocket?
Millinocket's actually named for the lake, Millinocket Lake, lake of various shaped islands.
Okay.
Well, places like Medway,
Yeah.
It's called Medway now, but it was always known as Nicketow, and that means at the fork. So that's where the east branch of the Penobscot meets the west branch of the Penobscot.
Oh,
it's a big fork.
James Francis is Penobscot tribal historian. We're going over the origins of all those Indian place names in the Maine map, and we've just barely scratched the surface. Up next, where could anybody find out more about Penobscot place names and culture? As Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and I'm with James Francis on Indian Island. He's Penobscot tribal historian. He's also Director of Cultural and Historic Preservation for the tribe. I'd like to wrap up the show today by asking where we can learn more about Penobscot history, culture, and all these place names we've been talking about.
We have a place names map for sale, which looks at the Penobscot River. We're also working on the fourth generations of maps. The watershed one is the third generation, but we are working to get printed currently another one. But if you go to penobscotculture.com, there's a section called Chimali's Trading Post, and we sell a wide variety of books and maps and other types of resources for people who want to learn more about who we are. Also on the website itself, you can read, about, say, Beshebes, who was our first documented chief who we named the upcoming canoe race for.
So if I go on that website, I'm likely to spend some coin because it sounds fascinating to me.
We hope, and we hope further that you people take the time to explore our history, from our point of view, because it's a very rich history, and we have a voice that we want people to hear.
Yep, and they're hearing part of it now at 50,000 watts.
Hey.
How about the tribe is actually making significant efforts to preserve its language too. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, with the dwindling number of speakers in our community, we are really at a place where we had to try to switch gears. And so one of the first things that I did when I became director is change the name of the program from a language preservation program to a language revitalization program. And just changing that term really changed the direction that we were going. Today we are in the midst of a huge project where we're actually recording every entry in the Penobscot dictionary. We're recording audio files and putting them into a database and using those audio files to inspire learning. We have 7 television sets within the community, one right outside this room, that is piping out Penobscot words and phrases all day long, every day, and putting the spoken language back in Penobscot's ears.
It can disappear on you quickly, too, because both my grandfathers, they say, were French extraction, but they married non-French women, and my parents, just one generation later, had to learn it in school.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I'm second generation non-speaker. My grandmother was fluent. So when we look at that, and for me, my generation is more apt, being second generation, to want to learn it. Where I think that first generation of non-learners are carrying something, guilt a lot of times that they didn't learn. But there's a lot of healing that needs to go on around language here in the community. But I think that we're well on our way. And for many years, my contribution was place names. But in the last couple of years, working as director, I felt it was my responsibility to not only be the director of the language program, but also an apprentice, someone who's learning the language on a daily basis.
Well, I started out this radio show completely clueless. Now I'm only partially clueless. I look forward to driving around in the Maine woods again and having a better sense of what these place names mean and what the derivations and origins might be. And certainly this show does give me a better sense of place than I started with. So I'm deeply grateful to you for all of your efforts and to the tribe for preserving this piece of history that I just didn't understand.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to let us have a voice. We appreciate every little bit of opportunity.
I've been sharing the last hour with Penobscot tribal historian James Francis, and now you have some idea what all those place names mean on the Maine map. Remember, there's a brand new canoe race that begins its existence tomorrow. Now the dams have been removed and the Penobscot River runs free below Milford. The first annual Bashebez Run happens tomorrow. Details at penobscotculture.org. That's penobscotculture.org. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Van Raymond Outfitters, Hammond Lumber, O'Neill's Power Equipment, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. Remember our web address if you want to hear the show again or recommend it to others, 929theticket.com. And I do think you might want to share the show with others. Join me next Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.